She had always been told that she wasn't strong enough. The crew had whispered it behind her back, the officers had hinted at it during meetings, and even her closest friends had given her that look, the look that said it all. "You're just not cut out for this." She wasn't the first to hear those words, nor would she be the last, but for her, it hit deeper than anything before. When the time came, when the universe demanded strength and the hard decisions had to be made, they chose the others. They left her behind because, to them, she was too weak. Too frail to contribute to the war effort, too fragile to survive the harsh conditions of intergalactic conflict. But the worst part wasn't the cold, silent abandonment of the crew. No, the worst part was the crushing feeling of betrayal, the sting of being deemed unworthy by those she had trusted. She had always believed that humanity, despite its flaws, stood united in its purpose. She believed that no one was ever left behind, no matter how difficult the situation. Yet here she was, stranded on an isolated planet, with nothing but the stars above her to remind her of what was lost. It wasn't the planet that made her feel small, but the weight of their judgment. The heavy silence as the ship's engines roared to life, leaving her alone in the darkened outpost, with nothing but the remnants of old supplies to keep her alive. The words rang in her ears as the ship's silhouette disappeared into the distance. "You're too weak." They left because they thought they were doing what was best, but in doing so, they sealed her fate in their minds. For days she sat in that desolate outpost, her only companions the howling winds and the distant echoes of her own thoughts. She could hear them, their voices still haunting her mind. The officers had spoken in hushed tones, their words laced with pity. "She can't keep up. She'll only slow us down. She's not built for this." Those words had followed her for years, planted in her mind like a seed that had grown into a forest of self-doubt. She had tried to ignore them, to push through the pain and prove them wrong. But now, sitting alone with nothing but time and the barren landscape around her, she couldn't escape it. They had been right, hadn't they? She had failed. She had let them down. And now, they had left her to die in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. Yet, even in the darkest moments, there was something inside her that refused to let go. There was a spark, however faint, that whispered she could still do something. She wasn't dead yet. The war wasn't over, and neither was she. But how could she prove it? What could she do alone, stranded on this desolate rock, with no resources, no training, and no support? She had been cast aside, a casualty of the war that had claimed so much already. Alone in a place where survival itself seemed impossible, how could she rise from the ashes of their dismissal? Survival, she realized, wasn't about physical strength. It wasn't about what others could see or understand. It was about resilience, the will to keep going even when everything around you tells you to stop. She wasn't a soldier. She didn't have the imposing frame or the sharp skills of her comrades. But what she did have, what they hadn't considered, was her will. They had left her because they saw only weakness in her, fragility in the face of battle. But they had missed something crucial. Strength wasn't just about muscle. Strength was the ability to keep moving, to keep fighting, no matter the odds. And in that moment, something inside her clicked. She wasn't weak. She had never been weak. The planet she was stranded on was nothing short of unforgiving. The conditions were harsh, the air thin and dry, the ground uneven and jagged. Survival in this hostile environment required ingenuity, cunning, and the ability to endure. Yet, as the days wore on, she began to adapt. It started small, learning how to filter the scarce water from the planet's barren surface, finding shelter from the brutal storms that tore through the landscape. Slowly, she began to rebuild. She scavenged what she could from the wreckage of the outpost, repurposing equipment that others would have discarded. What had once been a trap, a prison of isolation, began to feel like her sanctuary, a place where she could prove to herself that she wasn't defeated. The weight of her isolation began to lift. She was learning how to survive, not just in the physical sense, but in the mental and emotional sense as well. With every passing day, the feelings of self-doubt that had haunted her for so long began to fade. She was no longer the weak, fragile person they had believed her to be. She was more than that. In the stillness of her solitude, she realized that her worth wasn't defined by what they had seen in her. It wasn't about meeting their expectations. It was about defining herself, finding her own strength, and surviving in a world that had long since written her off. But even as she grew stronger, even as she began to piece together the remnants of her broken world, there was always that lingering doubt: what if they were right? What if she was too weak to survive this? What if they had abandoned her because there was no hope for her after all? The emptiness of the planet, the silence that stretched out for miles, made her wonder. What was the point of continuing? What was she fighting for if there was no one left to care? Then, a new thought struck her. Maybe the war wasn't over. Maybe, just maybe, they would come back. Perhaps they had abandoned her because they had thought she was too weak to survive. But what if they were wrong? What if she could rise above their expectations? What if she could show them that she wasn't just a casualty, but a force to be reckoned with? That question became her anchor. As she ventured further into the desolate planet, gathering resources, fighting off the elements, she realized that the battle for survival wasn't just about physical endurance. It was about proving to herself, and to the universe, that she was more than what they had believed. She wasn't just the weak one, the one who had been left behind. She was something more. Something they would soon come to understand. She was humanity's last hope, and she would make sure they knew it. In the quiet of the night, as the stars shimmered above her, she made a vow. She would rise, and she would never let them define her again. She wasn't just a survivor. She was a warrior in her own right, and soon, she would show the galaxy just how wrong they had been. The universe would learn her name, and they would learn that the thing they had discarded, the thing they had deemed unworthy, was the very thing that would save them all. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. She had learned to navigate the barren wasteland of the planet, using the environment to her advantage. Each day was a struggle, a battle against the elements, but she had begun to embrace it, to adapt. It wasn't just survival anymore, it was a challenge. A challenge she had chosen to face head-on. When she had first arrived at the outpost, the weight of being abandoned had nearly broken her. The crushing loneliness, the nagging voice of self-doubt, and the overwhelming sense of being utterly useless had been too much to bear. But now, something had changed. She had begun to see herself differently. She wasn't the weak one anymore. The constant struggle for survival had forced her to evolve, and with that evolution came the realization that she was capable of far more than she had ever imagined. Her first major breakthrough came when she managed to access a hidden supply cache buried deep beneath the outpost. It was a stroke of luck or perhaps fate, but inside she found more than just food and medical supplies. There were tools, communication devices, and even remnants of advanced technology. Technology she had no idea how to operate. But that didn't matter. It was a spark, a glimmer of hope that fueled her determination. If the galaxy thought she was weak, then it was time to prove them wrong. With limited resources, she set to work, learning how to repair the communication equipment and hacking into the satellite network. It was no easy task, and many times she wanted to give up, but something deep within her kept pushing her forward. She learned the language of the machines, understood their rhythms, their functions, and slowly, piece by piece, the systems came to life. The once abandoned outpost now felt like a base of operations, a command center from which she could make her move. The isolation of the planet, once her greatest burden, had become a weapon in her hands. It allowed her to think, to strategize, without distraction. She was no longer a helpless pawn in someone else's war. She was the master of her own fate, and as she gained more control over the technology, she started to piece together the bigger picture. The war was far from over, and she had no intention of letting humanity lose simply because they had written her off. She knew she wasn't the only one out there. The universe was vast, and with the right tools and enough time, she could make contact with the remnants of the war effort. There had to be others out there, others who had been abandoned or left behind, just like her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. But even as she worked tirelessly, her mind couldn't shake the memories of those who had left her. Her comrades, the officers, her friends, those who had deemed her too weak to be of any use. They had left her behind, and now, months later, they were probably on the front lines, fighting and dying, unaware that the very person they had abandoned was the key to turning the tide of the war. She often wondered if they ever thought of her, if they ever regretted their decision. But she pushed those thoughts aside. Regret wouldn't change anything now. Action was what mattered. As the systems in the outposts began to function again, she gained access to classified communications. The messages she intercepted were filled with desperate reports, updates on battles lost, and strategic positions that were quickly being overrun. The enemy was relentless, and humanity was losing ground. The few remaining colonies were on the brink of collapse. It was clear, if nothing changed, humanity was doomed. And yet, here she was, isolated, forgotten, with no one to turn to. The realization hit her hard. If she didn't do something, everything would be lost. But then, in the silence of the outpost, an idea began to form. The enemy was everywhere. They had taken over vast swaths of territory, and their forces were seemingly endless. But they weren't invincible. In fact, their greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. The very thing that made them so dangerous, their power, was dependent on a central command structure, a system that could be disrupted. She realized then that her role wasn't just to survive. It was to fight back. And not just in a way that might stall the inevitable, but in a way that could truly shift the tides of the war. With her newly restored communication systems, she was able to track enemy movements, identify weaknesses, and exploit gaps in their strategy. Slowly, she began to mount her own campaign, small, discrete operations designed to cripple the enemy's supply lines and communication networks. It wasn't much at first, but each small victory was a step in the right direction. She didn't need a fleet. She didn't need an army. She just needed to be clever, resourceful, and relentless. And she was all of those things. It wasn't long before her operations caught the attention of her former comrades. At first, they had written off the strange, isolated transmissions as nothing more than a glitch, a random signal from a derelict outpost. But as the sabotage continued, as critical systems began to fail, they couldn't ignore it any longer. Someone was out there, someone was fighting back, and the frequency of the attacks was too precise to be a coincidence. One evening, as she sat alone in the control room, she received her first communication from a fellow human. The voice on the other end was hesitant, unsure, but it was unmistakably human. Is this who I think it is? How are you alive? We thought you were dead." Her heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. They had found her. They had found her, and they knew what she had done. The tears came then, tears of frustration, tears of relief, and tears of validation. She wasn't weak. She wasn't forgotten. She was alive, and she was the key to saving humanity. But there was no time to savor the victory. The enemy was closing in, and she knew the clock was ticking. They had underestimated her, abandoned her, and now, she was humanity's last hope. As the realization set in that she had become humanity's final chance, the weight of it felt both empowering and suffocating. She had once been seen as weak, an afterthought, someone unworthy of consideration in a time of war. But now, she was their beacon of hope, the one person who had the knowledge and the resolve to turn the tide. And with that power came responsibility, a burden that could not be ignored. She couldn't afford to fail. There was no room for mistakes. Her plan, born out of the desperation of countless long nights alone, was daring but simple. She would infiltrate the heart of the enemy's operations, targeting their core infrastructure. But this wasn't just about a conventional attack. The enemy had grown too powerful, too entrenched, for traditional methods to work. What she needed was to strike at their very foundation, disrupt their command systems, disable their communication networks, and destroy the intelligence that kept them coordinated. If she could do that, she would create a fracture, a vulnerability that could be exploited by the remaining human forces scattered across the galaxy. The challenge was immense, but she had no choice. With every passing day, The enemy tightened their grip on more and more worlds, and her former comrades, those who had left her behind, were now just a few fading whispers. She wasn't sure if they even realized what was at stake anymore. They were fighting battles they couldn't win, while she, alone and forsaken, had discovered the key to victory. But how to communicate this to them? How could she make them understand that the key to humanity's survival wasn't just a military force, but an idea, the idea that they couldn't afford to abandon anyone, no matter how weak they seemed? It became clear that she couldn't simply sit back and wait for the cavalry. She would have to take action herself. Armed with only her intelligence and the knowledge she had gleaned from hacking into enemy systems, she began to infiltrate their ranks. Using the outpost as her command center, she initiated a series of calculated cyber attacks. Each one more daring than the last, each one pushing the limits of what she could achieve with the limited resources at her disposal. The risk of detection was ever present. The enemy's security was formidable, but it wasn't impenetrable. She learned their patterns, identified their vulnerabilities, and struck when they least expected it. Her attacks weren't large, explosive events, they were subtle, precision strikes. Critical systems were silently sabotaged. Supply lines were disrupted. Propaganda broadcasts were hijacked. It wasn't chaos she was sowing, but calculated confusion. She wanted them to feel uncertain, off balance, vulnerable. She knew that if the enemy was left unchecked, they would only continue to expand, steamrolling everything in their path. Meanwhile, the communications she had received from her former comrades grew more frequent. They were learning of her efforts, of the strange, unexplainable actions that had begun to disrupt the enemy's operations. At first, they had dismissed it as luck or coincidence, but as the attacks continued, they could no longer ignore the possibility that someone they had thought was dead, was orchestrating it all. They had no idea who she was, not yet, but the whispers of a mysterious force in the darkness began to spread. It was a game of patience, of playing the long game. She had no illusions that a single person could defeat the enemy. She couldn't fight this war on her own. But what she could do was shift the battlefield. By undermining their command structure, by leaving them questioning their own strength, she could weaken their resolve. She could create cracks in their armor, fractures that her comrades, those who had once abandoned her, could exploit. But as the days wore on, the pressure began to mount. The enemy wasn't stupid. They had begun to notice the pattern. The attacks, though subtle, were persistent. And with each strike, they seemed to be closing in on her location. She had to move faster, be bolder. The time for subtlety was over. She had to make her presence known, even if it meant revealing herself to the very forces she had been fighting so hard to undermine. She knew it was a risk, but it was a calculated one. The enemy had grown arrogant, believing that they had already won. They had underestimated the resolve of a single individual, someone they thought was too weak to matter. But now, it was time for them to realize that the greatest weapon wasn't in the size of an army, but in the heart of the one willing to fight for something greater than themselves. Her final attack was the culmination of everything she had learned, everything she had sacrificed. She had uncovered the heart of the enemy's network, a massive, centralized system that controlled not only their communications but also their ability to coordinate their forces. By infiltrating this system, she could disrupt their entire command structure. It was a delicate operation, one that required flawless precision. Any mistake would be catastrophic. With trembling hands, she initiated the sequence. The countdown began. She knew that once she triggered the breach, there would be no going back. There would be no way to hide, no way to retreat. She was in this to the end, and there was no turning back. The seconds felt like hours. The silence in the control room was deafening as she watched the progress bar slowly fill. It was a test of endurance, of mental and emotional strength. The closer she got, the more the weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her. But there was no time for hesitation. She had already come this far. The only option was to finish it. Finally, the sequence was complete. The breach had been initiated. A ripple of energy spread through the enemy's communication network, sending shockwaves across their system. The enemy was now blind, unable to coordinate their forces. Their central command had been shattered, and in that moment, the scales of the war tipped. It was far from over, but this single act of defiance had bought humanity the precious time they needed to regroup. As the realization sank in, she couldn't help but feel a sense of bittersweet victory. She had done it. The war wasn't won, but it had been changed. In a world that had once discarded her, she had become the force that had reshaped the future. The enemy had underestimated her. They had called her weak. But now, they would learn that there was no such thing as weakness when it came to survival, and that sometimes, the greatest strength came from those who had nothing left to lose. As the digital breach spread throughout the enemy's network, a strange sense of quietude filled her mind. The chaos she had just unleashed was calculated, but the aftermath was something else entirely. Her heart hammered in her chest, but the feeling of dread was quickly replaced by something more primal: hope. The plan was working, but it was just the beginning. The full weight of what she had done, the responsibility for a future that rested in her hands, was starting to sink in. Her once forgotten existence had transformed into something monumental. It wasn't just about sabotage or crippling the enemy's technology. It was about rewriting the rules of warfare itself. She had, for better or worse, become humanity's last hope. What was once thought to be her weakness, the inability to conform to the expectations of a traditional warrior, was now the very trait that had set her apart. It was her adaptability, her knowledge of both the enemy's systems and her own weaknesses, that had made her successful. She had learned how to fight a different kind of battle, one fought not just with weapons, but with ingenuity, patience, and sheer willpower. With each passing hour, the enemy's command network remained in chaos, crippled by the disruption she had caused. The first wave of confusion had rippled through their ranks, but this would not be a decisive victory, only a temporary one. The enemy was not foolish. They would regroup, recalibrate, and adapt. They had no choice but to retaliate. And they would come at her with everything they had. The war had only just entered a new phase, one where every decision, every move, would carry the weight of humanity's survival. The old her, the one who had been cast aside and left to fend for herself, would never have thought she could handle such responsibility. But the truth was, the desperation of being abandoned had forged a kind of strength in her that others could never understand. In that void of solitude, she had learned to rely on herself, to see opportunity in every challenge, no matter how impossible. And now, that strength, born from hardship and isolation, was the very thing that might save humanity. She wasn't just an individual anymore, she was a symbol, the embodiment of defiance against all odds. But as she moved forward with the next stage of her plan, she couldn't help but feel the weight of her isolation. The people she had once called comrades were now distant, out of reach, perhaps even disbelieving of what she had accomplished. After all, they had left her behind. They had presumed she was weak, incapable of fighting in a war that required strength and power. Could they ever truly understand what she had done? Could they ever realize that the traits they had scorned in her were the very things that had allowed her to survive and succeed? She had already proven them wrong. That much was undeniable. But it wasn't enough. She needed to do more. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival, about the future of humanity. She had no choice but to carry on. There was no time for self-doubt or regret. The path ahead was fraught with danger, and she would need every ounce of strength and cunning she had to succeed. As she initiated the next phase of the plan, rallying what little resources she had left, it became apparent just how much the enemy had underestimated humanity. The enemy had believed themselves to be invincible, a force so superior that they could wipe out entire civilizations with ease. But they hadn't counted on the resilience of those they deemed insignificant. They hadn't expected humanity's capacity to adapt, to fight back against impossible odds. And that, ultimately, would be their undoing. Her actions had drawn the attention of the remaining human forces scattered throughout the galaxy. They had watched in awe as the enemy's infrastructure began to crumble. At first, they had thought it was just a stroke of luck, a mere glitch in the system. But as the attacks continued, as the patterns became undeniable, they realized what was happening. They had underestimated her too, just as the enemy had. They had thought she was weak, that her efforts wouldn't amount to anything. Now they saw the truth. It wasn't about strength, it was about determination. It was about never giving up, no matter the odds. Her next step was to coordinate with the scattered remnants of humanity's military. She wasn't a leader in the traditional sense. She wasn't one to inspire crowds with grand speeches or heroic actions. But what she had was something far more valuable: the ability to think strategically, to see the bigger picture and work toward a goal without distraction. The rest of humanity's forces, scattered and disjointed, had no clear direction. They had been operating on instinct, fighting day by day, without any cohesive strategy. But now they had a leader, whether they knew it or not. They had a plan. She began to connect with the leaders of humanity's military forces. They were reluctant at first, unsure of who she was or how she had gained such detailed knowledge of the enemy's operations. But she proved her worth with each piece of information she provided. She had cracked their code, mapped their systems, and found ways to exploit their weaknesses. Her intelligence was irreplaceable. Slowly, one by one, the leaders began to trust her, to see that she wasn't just some lone individual acting out of desperation. She was a force, a mind capable of thinking beyond the limitations of ordinary warfare. But even with the support of her newfound allies, the task ahead was daunting. The enemy was regrouping, strengthening their forces, and preparing for retaliation. They would soon strike back with everything they had. And when they did, they would come for her first. They had no reason to believe that humanity had anything left to fight with. But they were wrong. Humanity was not defined by its weapons, its ships, or its armies. It was defined by its will to survive. And that will, that unyielding determination, was the true weapon that would tip the scales. In those dark moments, as she prepared for the battle ahead, she couldn't help but think of those who had abandoned her. They had thought her weak. They had believed she didn't have the strength to survive. But now, as she stood at the edge of a new dawn, she realized they were wrong. She wasn't just their hope. She was their salvation. And she would fight with everything she had to prove it. As the days stretched on, the weight of responsibility grew heavier on her shoulders. The forces she had rallied were no longer just a collection of individuals scattered across the galaxy. They were a unified front, a beacon of defiance against an enemy that had underestimated humanity's capacity for survival. She had become their symbol, their leader, not by choice, but by necessity. Her mind, once focused solely on her own survival, now had to encompass the survival of countless others. And as the days passed, her resolve only strengthened. The next phase of the operation was critical. It was no longer about surviving or hiding in the shadows. It was about striking back, reclaiming what had been taken, and ensuring that humanity's future was secure. Her plan was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it was the only option they had left. The enemy, despite their overwhelming power, had proven one thing: complacency. They believed they had won. They believed humanity was finished. That arrogance, that assumption of invincibility, would be their downfall. To execute her plan, she would need to work with the scattered remnants of humanity's military, a force that had been torn apart by years of warfare. Trust was not something that came easily to these groups. They had seen their comrades fall, watched their cities burn, and witnessed the unimaginable horrors of war. But now, as the first whispers of hope spread, they began to see the possibility of victory. They began to believe that maybe, just maybe, humanity could fight back. Her role in this fight had evolved. She was no longer just an agent of disruption, hacking into systems and sowing chaos. She was now the strategist, the one who could see the bigger picture, the one who could unite fractured forces and turn them into a cohesive unit. Her strength lay not in raw power, but in her ability to inspire those around her, to show them that their survival depended not on the strength of their armies, but on their unity and determination. She had to show them that they were more than just survivors. They were fighters, capable of reclaiming everything they had lost. The plan she had developed was a gamble, one that required precision and timing. It would take everything they had, every ship, every soldier, every resource, to pull it off. The enemy had a network of bases and strongholds scattered across the galaxy, each one a linchpin in their campaign to destroy humanity. But what the enemy didn't know was that their network was vulnerable. They had left themselves exposed in their overconfidence. They had focused so much on crushing humanity that they had overlooked the one thing that could bring them down, the very thing they had deemed weak. Her knowledge of the enemy's systems, gained through months of sabotage and observation, had given her the insight she needed to exploit their vulnerabilities. She had discovered gaps in their defenses, blind spots in their surveillance, and weaknesses in their communication networks. All of these would become key to turning the tide of war. It was not enough to strike at their military might. They needed to cripple the enemy's infrastructure, to make them question their dominance. And that's exactly what she planned to do. But the operation was not without its risks. The enemy would undoubtedly retaliate with everything they had. It was only a matter of time before they would direct their full force against her and the forces she had assembled. The stakes had never been higher. Failure was not an option. But there was something else, something that drove her forward despite the overwhelming odds. It was the knowledge that humanity was on the brink, that the fight was more than just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the soul of humanity itself. The emotional toll of the war weighed heavily on her. She had lost so much: friends, family, comrades. The faces of those she had failed to save haunted her, their voices echoing in her mind, reminding her of every choice, every sacrifice she had made. But it was those memories, those losses, that kept her moving forward. She fought not just for herself, but for the memory of those who had fallen. She fought for a future where their sacrifices had meaning. She fought for a world where the horrors they had endured would never be repeated. The final assault was launched, a coordinated strike that would take the enemy by surprise. It was not a massive army that would carry out this attack, but a small, highly skilled team of soldiers and engineers who had been carefully selected for their expertise. Each member of this team had a role to play, and together they would strike at the heart of the enemy's operations. They would take down their communications, sabotage their weaponry, and cripple their logistics. The goal was not to destroy the enemy's forces outright, but to make them question their ability to win. To make them see that humanity was not broken, that humanity was fighting back. The strike was swift, brutal, and effective. The enemy's strongholds began to fall, their systems faltering one by one. The chaos that ensued was exactly what she had hoped for. The enemy's forces, scattered and disoriented, struggled to regroup. They were no longer the invincible force they had once been. They were vulnerable, just like every other conqueror who had underestimated humanity's ability to fight back. And in that moment, as the first cracks began to show in their armor, humanity took its first step toward victory. But even in the midst of their success, she knew that the war was far from over. This was just one battle and a long and painful struggle. The enemy would not give up easily. They would regroup, reorganize, and come at them with everything they had. The fight would continue, but for the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope. They had proven that they could win, that they could strike at the heart of the enemy and emerge victorious. And that knowledge, that belief, would carry them through the darkest days ahead. In the end, her journey was not just about survival. It was about proving to herself and to the galaxy that she was never weak. She had been abandoned, cast aside, left to die by those who had believed she was too weak to survive. But now, she had become their savior. She had become the leader they never knew they needed. And in doing so, she had proven that strength is not always measured by brute force, but by the will to keep going, no matter the odds. She had shown them that humanity was not a lost cause. It was not a species doomed to extinction. No, humanity had the will, the ingenuity, and the heart to survive. And no matter what came next, she knew that humanity's fight was just beginning. And she would lead them, not as a soldier, but as the symbol of hope that they so desperately needed.